1. The speed that ate the sky. There's a figure somewhere in the dark between star systems right now, burning through the void at a velocity that should be aerodynamically impossible and mechanically suicidal, kept upright by nothing but orc engineering and a constitution chemically fortified past the point of biological reason. He's been riding for longer than most orc war bosses have been alive. He does not sleep and does not stop. The only time he leaves the saddle is to tear his machine apart with his bare hands and rebuild it larger, faster, and more dangerous than it was before. Then he climbs back on and picks up where he left off. His name is Wazdakka Gutsmek, and among the greenskins of the 41st millennium, that name has become something bigger than a reputation. It has become a theology. Speed is an orc religious experience, and Wazdakka Gutsmek is that religion's most extreme practitioner. The account of how a solitary mech boy from a desert world became the most dangerous biker in the galaxy is one of the stranger origin stories the 41st millennium has produced. 2. Khasak Prime and the education of a mech. The planet Kasak. Prime is a desert world, which means it is exactly the kind of place that should have produced nothing of military significance. It is dry, largely featureless from altitude, and the kind of world that Imperial cartographers flag with the designation resource poor, native population minimal, before moving on to more interesting entries. The orc tribes that occupied it when Wazdakka Gutsmek was growing up, there were evil sons, the most speed-obsessed of all the orc clans, which explains the direction his particular gifts would eventually take. He came up as a Mekaniak, which in orc society means he had the instinctive technical gifts that orc physiology distributes according to spore, and genetics rather than education or ambition. Mech boys are born knowing things about machines. The understanding of mechanical systems does not have to be explained to them or demonstrated in stages. They pick up a component and they already know what it does, where it goes, and how to make it do something its original designer never intended. What set young Wazdakka apart from the mech boys around him was the direction that natural talent took. Most mech boys are builders first. They love the creation of a machine, the assembly of parts, the satisfaction of making something that works when it previously did not. Wazdakka built machines to ride them. Every hour spent in construction was time purchasing time in the saddle. The bike he put together was always faster than the last one, stripped of mass and loaded with engine, tuned past the point where a sensible engineer would stop. His fellow mech boys thought this was eccentric at best. His fellow bikers thought it was suspicious. The desert of Khasak Prime gave him something most young bikers do not get: open ground with no obstructions, where a bike's theoretical top speed could be tested against actual reality. Wazdakka ran machines across that terrain until they shook themselves apart, then went back to the workshop and fixed whatever had failed. Then he ran them again. This cycle, repeated across what human observers would call the formative years, gave him a working understanding of mechanical failure at high velocity that no classroom instruction could have produced. He learned what a frame does under stress, what an engine sounds like 3 seconds before it destroys itself, and what a rider's body needs to survive a crash that should have been fatal. In orc biology, that last category is a broad one. 3. The Race of the Burning Wheels. There was, at some point in Wazdakka's early career, a race. The event was called the Race of the Burning Wheels, which is the kind of name orcs give to competitions they consider prestigious, and it was precisely the sort of challenge that Wazdakka's entire biography to that point had been building toward. He entered. He won. On a bike he had assembled from spare parts in the hours before the start. The other bikers did not accept this. Wazdakka had spent the pre-race period doing what he always did, taking the machine apart and putting it back together in a configuration faster than the one it arrived in, sourcing components from whatever was lying around, machining custom parts in the time other competitors spent eating or sleeping. When the race started, he was riding something essentially constructed from salvage in a matter of hours, and it was faster than anything else on the course. The accusation of cheating followed immediately. The accusation of cheating is a serious thing in orc culture, particularly among Speed Freeks, where mechanical superiority is the only currency that matters. To be accused of cheating means to have your victory stripped of meaning, the win belonging not to your skill but to some trick or deception that put you at an advantage the others did not share. For Wazdakka, who had built his machine honestly from available materials in the same time his competitors had access to, the accusation was intolerable. His response was, by any measure, disproportionate. He leveled the settlement. The Dakka cannons he had mounted on the bike, custom weapons of his own design, were put to work on the structures around him until there was considerably less settlement than there had been. Then he rode out into the desert and did not come back. The tribe banished him, though the practical difference between being banished and having already left under a cloud of his own gunfire was largely administrative. Stripped of his evil son's clan, tribeless, and entirely alone on a bike with nowhere specific to go, he had become what the orcs call a bad orc biker, a solitary rider outside the structures of normal greenskin society. Orcs without a tribe die, as a rule. They get killed in the endless territorial violence of greenskin society, or they starve, or they simply fail to accumulate the material and social resources that survival in the 41st millennium demands. Wazdakka did not die. 4. The Lone Road, Decades Without a Tribe. What followed the banishment was a period of Wazdakka's life that the Imperium knows only in fragments, assembled from the accounts of survivors who encountered him and the occasional trail of destroyed infrastructure he left across multiple systems. He moved between Waaghs as a freebooter, a freelance combatant who fought for any war boss willing to pay him in spare parts and fuel rather than teeth, whose skills were sufficient that even war bosses who found him personally irritating would tolerate his presence during a fight. He stayed for the violence and left before the politics could demand he subordinate himself to someone else's authority. The drug cocktails that kept him functional were supplied by outlawed pain boys, the sort of medically unsupervised practitioners that mainstream orc society had expelled from respectable surgery for reasons that tend toward the catastrophic. These docs supplied stimulants and compounds of uncertain composition that kept Wazdakka's nervous system operating when biology insisted it should shut down for rest. The long-term effects of this chemical regime on an orc physiology are difficult to assess, not least because the orcs who would need to run the assessment would first have to catch him. What is clear is that he pushed whatever limits orc biology has in this regard for decades without apparent consequence. The bike itself evolved continuously throughout this period. Whatever machine he had ridden out of Khasak Prime was progressively stripped and rebuilt until almost nothing of the original remained. Each Waaagh he passed through left him with new components, better salvage, superior materials to work with. The weapons grew more powerful, the engine grew larger and louder. The frame became something that had never appeared in any standard orc manufacturing specification, because it had never been manufactured to a standard specification. It was entirely Wazdakka's own creation, built to his preferences by his own hands, and it got faster with each iteration. During this period, something else was happening that Wazdakka himself may not have been consciously aware of. His reputation was spreading, fed by two things in particular: his raw speed and his sense of dramatic timing. His interventions in the Waaghs he passed through were effective and theatrical in equal measure. He had a gift for arriving at the exact moment a battle was tipping the wrong way and turning it back, and for doing so in a manner that was impossible to forget. Stories about the lone biker who had blown up his tribe and ridden into the desert had a quality that orc oral culture finds compelling. Extreme, independent, having refused to submit to authority and survived the consequences. Among Speed Freeks especially, Wazdakka became a reference point. Other bikers measured their own ambitions against what the stories said he had done. Whether or not he knew this, it did not change his itinerary. 5. Big Reva and the machine that has no equal. There is no official designation for the machine Wazdakka rides because official designations are generated by manufacturing processes, and his bike has never been manufactured. It has only been built over and over by one pair of hands, each iteration incorporating what the last version taught about its own limitations. Calling it a war bike is technically accurate in the same way that calling a Warlord Titan a walking weapons platform is technically accurate. The category is right and the reality is not close to captured. In older accounts, the machine carries the name Bike of the Apocalypse. Current sources from the Armageddon theater identify the bike by a different name, Big Reva. Whether these represent two different machines or two different names for the same continuously rebuilt chassis is a question the vehicle itself probably renders irrelevant, given that so little of any prior iteration survives into the current one. Whatever it is called, the machine is Wazdakka's entire life. It does not travel without him, and he does not travel without it. The machine is massive. Where standard Ork warbikes are already oversized relative to what humans would consider a motorcycle, Big Reva occupies a physical footprint closer to a light vehicle than a two-wheeled machine. The engine is the kind of project that would require a team of mech boys working in shifts to maintain under normal operating conditions. Wazdakka maintains it alone, with the assistance of a single Gretchen designated Fix-It, whose job is to keep the machine clean between engagements and who has, by all accounts, maintained this role with a dedication his employer does not appear to have reciprocated with any particular warmth. The primary weapon in the machine's current configuration is the Psycho Gatler, capable of output that most Ork shooters have no business attempting. In earlier iterations of the hardware, this weapon role was filled by the Daka Cannon, a modified twin-link shooter that Imperial reports described as capable of penetrating tank armor. The principle has remained consistent across iterations. The weapon mounted on the front of this bike should be able to kill things that bikes have no right to be killing. How Wazdakka integrates a weapon system of this capacity into a vehicle also expected to achieve the speeds his riding style demands is a mechanical puzzle that Adeptus Mechanicus analysts have been trying to solve from salvaged components without conclusive results. Older accounts of the Bike of the Apocalypse describe turbo boosters capable of launching the machine across distances that should be physically impossible for a vehicle of its mass. Sufficient vertical and horizontal displacement to clear obstacles, cross gaps, and reach elevated positions that a ground-based vehicle would otherwise have no access to. The current configuration of Big Reva replaces this with the Throttlerokkit Shokka Engine, a propulsion system with 3 distinct operating modes. Pulse Jet generates raw speed across open ground. Shock Attack Mode allows the bike to vanish from one position and reappear elsewhere at combat speed, removing the problem of crossing open ground under fire. Turbo Engine is the close combat setting, crashing the bike into enemies at full charge velocity. Wazdakka appears to have interpreted all 3 primarily as different ways of achieving the same outcome, arriving somewhere at maximum speed in a manner nobody is prepared for. 6. From solitary biker to speed boss, the Waaagh coalesces. The moment Wazdakka Gutsmek stopped being a lone figure and became a warlord was not a single decision. It was a process that happened around him, driven more by the gravity of his reputation than by any deliberate political ambition on his part. Speed Freeks who heard the story sought him out. Bikers who had been riding in other formations peeled away when they encountered him in the field, and simply stayed in his wake. War bosses who controlled large groups of speed-obsessed orcs found that their subordinates were increasingly interested in the direction Wazdakka was heading. His reputation had passed the point of being something one orc told another and become something closer to myth, the kind of story that speed freaks across the galaxy were passing around in the dark between engagements. Orc ways coalesce around the weight of personality. A war boss large enough, loud enough, and visibly successful enough in combat will draw other greenskins to him, and that gravity compounds over time. The greater the gathering, the greater the reputation, which draws more greenskins, which increases the reputation further, until the Waaagh achieves the critical mass where it becomes hard to stop by conventional military means. Wazdakka's Waaagh followed this pattern, but with a peculiarity that distinguishes it from the standard model. It drew exclusively from the Speed Freek community. A conventional Waaagh is a broad formation that includes infantry, heavy weapons, dedicated mech-boy units, air power, and armored vehicles in roughly the proportions that orc biology and tribal culture naturally produce. Wazdakka's Waaagh is entirely bikers, war trucks, Daka jets, and every fast-moving vehicle the greenskin military tradition has ever produced. There is almost no infantry component. There are no siege formations. The entire force structure is optimized for speed and forward pressure, which makes it uniquely lethal in mobile engagements and potentially vulnerable in static defensive situations. A vulnerability that the Imperium has so far not managed to exploit because Wazdakka does not engage in static defensive situations. He intended to lead his Waaagh from one end of the galaxy to the other, the greatest race in the history of existence, a single continuous charge across the entire breadth of the Milky Way, from one galactic boundary to the opposite one, consuming everything in the path and returning to Gork and Mork, the pure, screaming, engine-driven devotion that Speed Freek theology holds as the highest possible act of worship. 7. The Forge World and the God Machine. Scalex VI is the battle most frequently cited when Imperial analysts attempt to convey the threat level Wazdakka Gutsmek represents. What happened there stands apart even by the standards of Orc military history. Scalex VI was an Imperial Forge world, which meant its defense was entrusted in part to the Titan legions of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The specific formation deployed to stop the Speed Freek horde was built around a Warlord-class Titan, which is about as severe a defensive resource as the Mekaniak can field in a single engagement. A Warlord Titan stands 30 meters tall, carries weapons capable of leveling city blocks, and is shielded by void fields specifically designed to stop the kind of energy-based and kinetic attacks that any attacking force would think to bring against it. The Speed Freeks found this out firsthand. The kinetic slug weaponry that orcs shoot as fire in volume is effective against infantry, light vehicles, and lightly armored positions. Against a Warlord Titan's hull and its active void shielding, it accomplished approximately nothing. The Titan's Mega Blasters began working through the Speed Freek formation methodically. The ferrocrete of the planet's forges ran slick with orc blood and motor oil. Wazdakka rode up to a mesa overlooking the engagement. He pointed the bike at the Titan, revved the engine to whatever its maximum output was at that point in its development, and launched off the cliff edge. When the bike hit the void shield envelope, the gravitic field ignited both rider and machine. Wazdakka burned. The bike burned. Neither of them stopped. He came through the shield still on fire, still moving at combat speed, and hit the Titan's cockpit canopy. The crew inside had no time to respond before Wazdakka, still burning, was inside the command compartment with them. He killed them with his power claw in seconds. Orc and man alike stopped fighting and stood watching, which suggests the event had crossed some threshold where its sheer improbability temporarily suspended the normal imperatives of combat. The Titan fell. Scalex VI fell with it. The Forge World's manufacturing capacity was redirected under coercion and at gunpoint toward producing vehicles for the Waaagh. Since that day, Wazdakka has kept the skulls of the Titan's princeps and command crew as trophies, still burning, mounted where any enemy foolish enough to get a close look at the machine can read the lesson they carry. 8. Waaagh! Gutsmek and the route through the Segmentum Solar. With Scalex VI behind him and its production lines feeding the Waaagh, Wazdakka had something no Speed Freek warlord before him possessed: a trajectory. The Waagh's projected course cuts directly through the Segmentum Solar. The Segmentum Solar is the most heavily populated and defended region of Imperial space, containing Terra itself and the densest concentration of Imperial military assets anywhere in the galaxy. Running a Speed Freek. Waaagh through it is either the worst possible route choice from a survival perspective, or it is the only sensible choice for a biker committed to crossing every system between here and the galactic rim, and whose definition of the route does not include detours around inconvenient concentrations of enemy firepower. The proximity of the route to Terra has drawn the attention of the Adeptus Custodes, specifically the Dreadhost formation. The Custodes do not typically involve themselves in Xenos engagements outside the immediate environs of the Throne World. Their direct involvement in trying to stop Waaagh. Gutsmek tells you something about how seriously they are taking his trajectory. The warriors whose entire existence is oriented toward the protection of the Emperor's seat are personally committed to this engagement. The obstacle that has proven most intractable for Wazdakka's galactic traverse is the phenomenon the greenskins call Gork's Grin, the massive scar torn through real space by the opening of the Great Rift. The rift divides the galaxy in a way that makes the simple act of crossing from one side to the other considerably more complicated than it was in the era before the Noctis Eterna. For anyone trying to draw a straight line across the full width of the galaxy, a warp storm scar cutting it roughly in half represents a significant routing problem. Wazdakka's answer to this is Ghazghkull Thraka. Ghazghkull, the war boss whose Waaagh represents the largest single greenskin military formation currently operating in the galaxy, has access to teleported technology of significant capability. teleporters move things through the warp without requiring standard warp transit, functioning as a way around the navigational hazard the rift presents. If Wazdakka helps Ghazghkull take Armageddon, he can barter passage through to the Imperium Nihilus, and that passage would be only the first link in a permanent portal network running across the galaxy, the infrastructure for a race with no finish line. 9. Armageddon, the road that runs through history. Armageddon is a planet with a particular weight in the 41st millennium. It has been the site of multiple catastrophic wars, each of which has added another layer to its reputation as a place where the Imperium and the greenskins test each other to destruction on a rolling generational basis. The Orcs associate Armageddon with Ghazghkull. The Imperium associates it with Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, who has spent a career defined in large part by his relationship to the planet and everything that tries to take it. Wazdakka's Waaagh made landfall ahead of Ghazghkull's main force, consistent with the Speed Freek doctrine of being first to arrive at every engagement. His force represents the vanguard of an invasion whose full weight, including Ghazghkull's primary contingents, has yet to arrive. The Speed Waaagh rolling across Armageddon is the opening movement of something considerably larger. Yarrick issued a desperate plea for reinforcement that triggered Operation Imperator, drawing Space Marine chapters toward the embattled planet. The Imperial response is reactive by the nature of the situation. The Waaagh is already on the ground. The clash between Wazdakka and Yarrick runs deeper than a military engagement between two commanders. Yarrick's entire reputation rests on holding the line, on surviving what should not be survivable through a combination of will, stubbornness, and the kind of personal ferocity that Orcs respect more than any other quality in an enemy. Wazdakka's reputation rests on never stopping, on maintaining forward momentum regardless of what the environment places in the way. Two figures defined entirely by the refusal to quit, meeting on a world that has been built from centuries of exactly that kind of refusal on both sides. The Imperium has been trying to hold Armageddon since before either of them was born, and the Orcs have been trying to take it for just as long. Whatever happens here will add another layer to what the planet already is. 10. What Wazdakka Gutsmek actually is. Pull back from the military threat assessment, and the figure underneath is something more interesting. A mech who became, without apparently intending to, the living embodiment of what the Orc cult of speed actually worships. Speed Freek theology holds that velocity is itself sacred. The Orcs understand Gork and Mork as twin gods of war, each one brutal and cunning in different combination. One is brutally cunning, the other cunningly brutal, and the Orcs themselves often disagree over which is which. What Speed Freek theology adds to this is a third element: momentum. To be moving faster than anything else, to be ahead of every danger and every consequence, to have left all stillness permanently behind, is the closest a greenskin can come to divine experience within this framework. The universe cannot catch you if you are moving fast enough. Death has to be stationary to claim you, and if you never stop, it cannot. Wazdakka has been testing this theology empirically for longer than anyone has been keeping count. He went through void shields on fire and emerged still moving. He has ridden through engagements that consumed entire formations around him and come out the other side still on the bike. The drug cocktails keeping him awake are not a weakness in this reading, but a sacrament. The chemical suppression of the biological imperative to stop, the pharmaceutical argument against stillness. For the speed freaks who ride in his wake, Wazdakka is the theology made physical. He is the idea of speed given a name and a face and a psycho-gatler, riding a machine rebuilt so many times it has become a philosophical argument about what a bike is rather than any specific vehicle. The skull trophies burning on the handlebars carry a message. Here is what happened to a Warlord Titan when it tried to stop the fastest thing in the galaxy. The machine fell. The rider kept going. The grand ambition, the galaxy-spanning race, is not a military objective in any conventional sense. To ride from one edge of the galaxy to the other without stopping is to demonstrate, at the largest possible scale, that nothing in this universe is large enough or heavily armed enough to make Wazdakka Gutsmek stop. It is a theological argument delivered at engine volume, and the Imperium of Man is the terrain it has to cross to make the point. The road is already the worship, and somewhere between Armageddon and the galactic rim beyond, the engine is already running.